Who was here last week Sunday? Who was here last week Sunday? Okay. I ask this because you may recall that we spoke about the qualities of the Buddha and how they are related to our mental defilements. And how one of the qualities of the Buddha is simplicity and renunciation. You may recall that. And how simplicity and renunciation is the medicine or antidote for self-centered craving and attachment. How simplicity helps us to overcome craving, and how renunciation helps us to overcome personal attachment, personal clinging. Normally, when we first hear about renunciation, we think about cultural renunciation, which means somebody becoming a monk or a nun. But renunciation really is much more than becoming a monk or a nun. As we said last week, it's really the practice of letting go of personal clinging and attachment. Because in my travels and experience as a as a traveling Dhamma teacher and as a monk, I see that you can be a monk or a nun and still have a lot of attachments, what we call worldly. We still have a lot of worldly attachments. Craving for material things, and even craving for personal, aggrandizement. Want to enhance the ego. Wanting recognition, wanting fame, wanting titles. And that's just another form of craving. So in other words, the real renunciation, the real spirit of renunciation is in the mind. It's not whether you're wearing robes and having your head shaved. That is only cultural, the external form of renunciation. The real renunciation is letting go in the mind of craving, ego clinging, attachments, pride, arrogance, conceit, letting go of jealousy, aversion, hatred, resentment, and so on. So it is in the mind. And once you start to practice, you can see the truth of it yourself. It's all in the mind. Everything begins with the mind. As they say, mind is the forerunner of all things. Now, one of the aspects of clinging I did mention, and I want to mention it today because it is very important, and that is when we cling to mental formations, i.e., ideas, concepts, beliefs, views and opinions, and so on. Because when we cling to these things, they really cause suffering, they really cause conflict. And that's why so many people are caught in arguments and, fights over what I believe and what you believe, sometimes even what I like and what I don't like. And if you don't like something that I like, of course, I feel I have to convince you that you must like it. Or if you like somebody and you don't like that person, you want to convince that person why you should also dislike that person, That's part of human behavior. Because the clinging mind is so strong, as you know. Somebody once likened the clinging mind to glue. You remember crazy glue? That instant, fast bonding glue. The mind is like crazy glue. It quickly bonds, quickly clings to something. And when we investigate, you see the strong clinging is really because of thinking. That is the essence of it, when we cling to all these mental formations. Because thinking is just a strong, prominent aspect of consciousness. And when we're not trained at an early age, to see the mind with mindfulness, of course, our entire identification, our entire world is thinking, mental reacting to everything. So that is our reality, our mental reactions, our mental world. And as what somebody said, really, when you really reflect on life and our experiences, it's really 10% of things happening, things, events, and 90% of our mental reacting to all, what is happening. 90%, it's really true. And of course, our mental reactions is what creates our reality, right? We think what we are reacting to is real. And what the Dhamma is teaching us, that really it's a cause of suffering, cause of conflict. Because that is where our mental defilements lie. Ignorance, delusion, craving, clinging, aversion, hatred, jealousy, envy, and so on. And is it this conditioning that we all have, this habitual reaction, which creates the idea of a permanent self. That's what ignorance is the clinging to the self. Or you can say taking ourselves too seriously. So, and I mentioned too that the teaching of non-self, when we first encounter it, it's very difficult to understand, very, very challenging. Because, we tend to say, I exist. My name is so-and-so. I'm working, I'm having a certain profession. I have a family, or I don't have a family. So what do you mean I don't exist? Of course I exist. And also I get sick, I'm going to grow old, and one day I'm going to die. Which I don't like. I don't like that idea, but there you go. So to really understand this teaching of non-self is first we have to understand that we do have a self. Right? So whether we like it or not, because it's a part of our conditioning. Because as human beings, we're a result of social conditioning. Just like we have to learn languages, we have no choice, do we? To learn languages. From the home environment and of course from school and so on. We have no choice. We have to learn all these things. And we have to go to school. And even if you're having homeschooling, which is getting more popular these days, is still a part of our social conditioning. We can't escape education. Just like the media, we can't escape the media. And now we have internet and all that stuff. And just our social ideas, including beliefs, popular beliefs. And a lot of it is superstitious also, superstitious beliefs. So we have to understand, yes, we do have a self, but when we investigate, as the Buddha did, we begin to see that it's just a part of the conditioning in the mind. It's not something which is permanent, not something which is separate, independent from nature. But for centuries and centuries, all the early civilizations believe in a permanent self. Because of course they were just trapped in thinking, right? In the conditioning. They didn't have the insight, the, the mind training to really see the true nature of the mind, thinking and so on, because it's thinking that creates the I, you see. And from this very ancient belief in a permanent I, self, naturally arose the belief in reincarnation. That when the body dies, which it must, this seemingly permanent, solid, separate, independent I, the center of experience, and also the center of our world, will continue into a new body, be reborn into a new body. And also, you see, when we cling to our mental formations, our beliefs, ideas, views, and opinions, we don't realize that it is the work of delusion, and very often the source of our conflicts. As we said, that's why people are always arguing. And of course, I am always right and you are wrong. Because for me to be right, you have to be wrong. It's like this. But when you're really right, when you're really wise, you tell everyone they're right. But of course, you know from your wisdom that they're all wrong. When you say, oh yeah, you're right, whatever, you're right. You know, just to keep them happy, keep them satisfied. Because after a while, it's really a waste of time to argue, especially in this climate. That's why I don't argue with people. I always say, you believe what you want to believe. Doesn't matter. You can even believe the world is flat. Because some people still believe that. And of course, if you live in some countries and you look outside, it is flat, very flat. You know, there are some places in North America where you look outside and you look everywhere and there's not a bump, not even a little bump inside. Totally flat, flat, flat. And it takes a while to get used to it, you know, especially when you're used to hills and mountains, right? And because it's so flat, the sky is enormous, you know, from one horizon to the next. Not a single bump. And sometimes somebody will show you something in the distance. They say, what? I can't see what you're talking about. Say, yeah, you look there, you look. And you can't see what they're pointing to. But a few days, you know, you get used to it. Those flatness and the vast horizons and so on. And then afterward, you can see it. But initially, you're not used to it. To look in such vast distances. Unless, you know, you have a pair of binoculars and so on. And of course, in our daily lives, you know, we see things changing all the time, don't we? It's so obvious, but of course we don't notice it after a while. And yet, because we're caught up, you know, in this delusion of a permanent self, and we have personal preferences, personal attachments. Because of our personal attachments, we don't want certain things to change. Although we see things changing all the time, but because of our personal attachment, we don't want certain things, and including certain people, certain situations, you know, that we like or are very comfortable with. We don't want them to change. We want all the things and all the people that we're attached to, we want them to be permanent. Because we think in our ignorance that, you know, I am permanent, and yet we see change all the time. So this is what we call ignorance, you know. We're ignoring the truth of things. And let's be honest, if you don't like somebody, you don't care if they're impermanent, right? You know? And especially, if they're not only unpleasant, but, if they've done bad things to you, hurt you, cheat you, and so on. If they have a heart attack and drop dead, thank God. Good riddance. Or if they get kidnapped, by aliens and taken far away to another solar system, other side of the galaxy, good riddance. It's just human nature. And a very good example of that, say you have an old car, have a few, scratches and bumps, and it gets another scratch or a little bump. It's just an old car, no problem. But think of it, you bought a brand new car, and the slightest scratch, wow, you see, right? You're so upset. The slightest scratch, because it's a brand new car, right? And if a bird flies over and drops a blessing on your brain, you want to kill that bird, right? That damn bird. It's a part of our human nature. The power of attachment is so strong. And if you listen to the media, the radio, TV, you hear about people dying all the time, don't we? But if you don't know that person, there's really no suffering. You might say, oh well, too bad, but that's life. But if you know that person, personally, of course you're more affected by that. And I remember once a close friend of mine from university days, he died in an unfortunate accident. And when I heard his death being announced on the radio, it was so strange. To hear someone that you hear on the radio that this person has died. You just can't believe it. Now, I'd just like to do a reading here. This process of the constant change of things, personal or impersonal, internal or external, goes on constantly even without our noticing it, and affects us intimately in our daily life. Our relationship with people is constantly changing, with family members, relatives, friends, co-workers, and supervisors, and so on. Even our possessions change. Our feelings, emotions, and moods, our states of mind, our thoughts and ideas, our views and opinions, even our beliefs, our likes and dislikes are subject to change and impermanence. Marriages are challenging and difficult simply because people change. And what's a common saying when couples are fighting and arguing? A very common saying is, "What happened to you? You're not the person I married." Right? It's so true, and the reason is because we change. It's that simple. Solar systems and stars are impermanent. Hills and mountains erode, likewise landscapes, the courses of rivers, coastal areas change, the four seasons. Of course, you don't have the four seasons here. Rainy days and dry days, and so on. Understanding change and impermanence is the antidote to strong attachment and clinging and craving and ill will. Remembering death especially is a friend and teacher in Dhamma practice. It is a wise reminder of the folly of strong attachment and greed, aversion and ill will. How many quarrels, petty disagreements, long ambitions and enmities and grudges fade into insignificance when we remember the inevitability and certainty of death, the impermanence of all things and the ego personality. This reminds me, you might have heard the story. This is actually an event that took place during the Buddha's time. And it occurred around at the 9th or 10th year of his teaching. And by then, the Sangha had grown considerably as the Buddha's reputation spread as a very radical, profound, very wise and compassionate teacher. And this event took place that threatened to split the Sangha in two, or almost in two. And it started when two monks began an argument about a very minor precept. Very minor. But they were the argumentative type. Very proud, very intellectual. And they were not too keen on mindfulness practice. They rather chit-chat and argue. Some people are like that. And the argument continued day after day. They wouldn't let it go. Although the Buddha kept advising the monks, to be diligent in their practice, on Dhamma reflection. And eventually, other monks began to join the argument and they began to take sides. And before you knew it, you got two fairly large groups of monks arguing about the same stupid thing, minor thing. And each day, of course, they became more heated, more deluded. And eventually the Buddha stepped in and he tried to get the monks to stop arguing and to go back to their practice and Dhamma studies and reflection. But they were so heated, so deluded, they just ignored the Buddha and just kept on. So the Buddha quietly went to another forest, a few kilometers away. And he was happy just to have his peace and quiet. Because, he was a solitary person by nature. And the following morning, as was the tradition, when all the monks went alms around, Pindabat, around the villages, the villagers asked them, where is the Buddha? Because they knew he was in the area. So they were really looking forward to offering him dana, get his blessings, and later, they would get teachings from him. So the monks told the villagers what had happened. They got into all this argument, and the Buddha tried to stop them, but they were so heated, so deluded, they just ignored the Buddha. So the Buddha left. And the villagers did a very wonderful thing. They went on strike. And they said, since you're so disrespectful to your teacher, you don't deserve dana. Very good thing they did. And they quickly spread the word to the other villages, surrounding villages. Don't give dana to these monks. They're very disrespectful. They don't deserve it. Of course, there were a few monks who were not involved with the argument, but they had to also go without dana. That's the way life is. Now, the life of those early monks, their lives were so simple, austere, so they could manage at least one day without food. And sometimes, there were like fruits, wild fruits, and certain leaves they could eat and roots, but they could manage. But after 2 or 3 or 4 days, the pain of hunger got stronger and stronger. And eventually they came to their senses and they realized how stupid, how immature, how deluded they were, to continue this argument. Because that's the nature of delusion, right? When you're so heated and deluded. So they found out where the Buddha was. They went to the Buddha, apologized, and asked for forgiveness. And the Buddha said, every day you must, in your practice and reflection, including your mindfulness practice, you must always remember the truth of impermanence and the certainty of death. Because when you consider this truth, you realize how foolish it is to cling to all these ideas, beliefs, arguments, including, your resentments and all these things, holding grudges, negativity. You see, in the light of impermanence and death, is completely useless. And he ended by saying, of all mindfulness practices, that on death is supreme. But of course, you reflect on death not as something to be afraid of, but as a fact of life. And the reflection on death as a very wise teaching is beneficial when the mind is calm. When the mind is calm and clear, and you can see death not as something scary, or not as the enemy of life, as how some people see it, but just the fact of life. And that there is death simply because there is birth, right? Without birth, there would be no death. It's that simple. Now, when the Buddha said, see the world as something which is impermanent and constantly changing. See the world as something which is unsatisfactory, uncertain, simply because it is changing. And see the world as something which is devoid of a permanent, separate, independent self. He was not speaking about the external, empirical world, the world out there, but rather the world of Namarupa, mind and body process, with its sixth sense consciousness. Because he said, when we really practice, we begin to see this truth. Because initially we don't see that. Again, because of our conditioning, right? We're always reacting to what we are seeing. And of course, I like, I don't like, that's beautiful, that's ugly, I want, I don't want, I hate that person is awful, and so on. So we always feel that I am here and the world is out there. But when we bring mindfulness in the present moment, we begin to see this very profound truth, that the world actually is here. Through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking. It's a very profound teaching, but as I said, once you practice and you reflect, you begin to see this very obvious truth. For example, what is the world as we know it at this moment? It's this hall, isn't it? And you're hearing and seeing the speaker. Right? Now, the moment you step out of this room, you go other parts of the vihara, your world changes, doesn't it? It's not this room anymore. And of course, if you're taking lunch, part of your world, part of your consciousness is tasting and smelling. So even consciousness is changing. And once you get in your car and you start driving, with all that crazy traffic in KL these days, you see you're in a different world, aren't you? Mm-hmm. And you have to pay attention when you're driving. And of course, when you get home in your familiar home environment, you're in a different world. You're in your home environment, which you're familiar with. And if you don't turn on the television, and watch the news, your world, your consciousness is not affected by all that bad news. Because most news, it's bad or it's negative. Rarely you'll hear a good news. And it's always refreshing, when you can hear something positive, but most of it is negative, isn't it? This is why I often advise people, try to watch as less news as possible. Because really it's a form of mental pollution. Because, I know people, including my brother, they watch so much television and they have all this input because really it's mental pollution when you think of it. And you see how it affects people's mind. It makes you very negative, very anxious, sometimes even depressed also. Because the media is very powerful, right? Because you're bombarded constantly by these images. Just like I met a friend yesterday and he was telling me about the political situation in Malaysia, and I said to him, please stop watching or reading the news, or try to avoid it as much as possible. Because sometimes it's not easy. And even in Canada, I rarely watch or read the news. The only news I hear is very brief, and it's usually because of the radio, a few statements on the radio. I rather want to know what is happening right now, the world of one's immediate environment. And just pay attention to what you're doing. And you begin to see the truth that the world really is here. And you see the constant change. And why things are impermanent and changing in our world is really a very simple explanation. And that is, we are in truth, in fact, not this permanent I, known as Mr. Go or Mr. Tan or Bhante, but rather we are a process of body and mind. If we're not a process, we would not be alive. It's so obvious, isn't it? Just like our breathing is constantly changing, isn't it? And when we eat, the process of digestion is very, very complex. But fortunately, because the body is so intelligent, we don't have to worry about it, right? We just eat and go to sleep or do something else. But the body has this incredible intelligence to deal with this incredible thing called digestion. Once I took a course in biochemistry, and that's what we did. Study about the body and the digestion process. And I was so amazed how complex it is. All the different enzymes and acids that are involved to break the food down so that the body can absorb the nutrition. And of course the rest is expelled. Very complex, and you can really appreciate the intelligence of nature, the body. I once knew a Canadian lady who was doing a volunteer work in India, and she developed a digestion problem. And luckily, the foundation that she was involved with, it was Mahatma Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, one of his village programs. They have these natural cure centers. And at the Natural Cure Center, she was able to go on a 1 month fast. Can you imagine, 1 month? And everything was, monitored, carefully monitored. And the idea was to give the body a complete rest because of the digestion process, so that its natural process could come back to normal. Extraordinary experience, she said. The only thing that she took was once an hour she had a teaspoon of water, because the body, the cells need water. That's all, 1 teaspoon. And she said she had never felt so wonderful in her life. If you've ever fasted, you know that the first 2 days are really challenging, because all you think about is food. And all the food you have ever eaten, you go through all the recipes and all the different types of makan. And even food that you've never eaten but you would like to try, that come up in your mind also. It's quite extraordinary. But fortunately, after 2 days, the hunger goes away, and then you feel really good. You feel very calm, very clear, and of course no hunger to worry about. Yeah, she was able to fast for 1 month. And she said after 2 weeks, it was like she was floating. She felt so light, so clear. Of course, she did yoga, there was herbal massage, herbal baths, and so on. And she came to a point where she thought, maybe I won't have to eat ever again. But of course, eventually, you have to start eating again. Yeah. She lost about 25 pounds. But that was not the initial goal, to lose weight. But you do, of course, you lose weight when you're going on such a long fast. And also, when you go on a long fast, what is most important, you have to break the fast very gradually. Very gradually. Just to get the body used to nutrition again. It's all liquids, all liquids. I would like to do this, but not for a month, maybe 2 weeks. I would love to do one of these for 2 weeks to give the body a complete rest. But I said if you're not having from digestion problems, it's quite amazing how the body can deal with this very complex process. And of course, because we're a process of constant change, you can see how the mind is changing constantly. For example, if I ask you, can you tell me about how many thoughts that have arisen in your mind since you woke up this morning? No idea, just countless. Or how many objects you have seen. Or how many sounds you have heard. Or when you are walking, exactly how many touch sensations you experience, and so on. And of course, how many breaths you have taken, since say 6 o'clock or 7 a.m. this morning. So that is the reality of process. But there's actually a practice, mindfulness practice, when you're on a retreat, where you really focus on getting in touch with this fact of just body and mind, physical and mental process. So you're really in touch with it as a fact. For example, say if you're doing walking meditation, the movement of your feet and touching, that is the physical, or in Pali it's called rupa, body. And the awareness of the movement and the touching is mind, nama. You see body and you see mind. Physical and mental phenomena. When you're eating mindfully and you're focusing, the physical experience of eating, tasting, chewing, swallowing, that of course is the body, physical process, and the awareness of the tasting, chewing, Swallowing is the mind, nama. You see, rupa and nama, that's all. No I, there's no I there. And of course, with mindful breathing, the physical sensation of the breath, that is rupa, the body, and the awareness of the physical sensation of the breath is mind, nama. And of course, when you're on a retreat, you really see this clearly. There's only body and mind, only rupa and nama. And this is one of the teachings to really see the truth of anatta, no self, that there's only body and mind. And also you begin to see that the I, the self, arises only when we start thinking, I this, I that, or we start speaking. I this, I that. The arising of I. It really comes from language and of course thoughts and so on. So if you ask me, who's sitting here speaking? Nama Rupa, or Rupa Nama. That's right. Of course, on the social level, I'm Bhante Kovida from Canada, blah, blah, blah. But at that deep level, only Nama Rupa, only body-mind. And guess what? We're all Nama Rupas sitting here. Only Nama Rupa. It's actually a very profound teaching when you go into it. Because when you have this understanding, it helps us to go beyond all the social labels that we have. Right? Because as human beings, we have social labels, don't we? Including even I'm a man or I'm a woman. It helps you to go beyond even gender. Or even I'm a mother or I'm a father. Or I'm a monk, I'm a lay person, I'm a doctor, lawyer, engineer, IT specialist. These are all social labels, aren't they? Including prime minister, president, king, queen. These are all social labels, but there's that very fundamental reality of this body and mind. And when I'm in the UK, I like to give this teaching because European civilization, including British, they've had a long history of titles, and so many different titles, of all the aristocracy and of course the royalty. But when you understand that whoever you are, with all these titles, you're still Nama Rupa. And it doesn't matter who you are with your titles, because you're Nama Rupa like the rest of us, we are still subject to sickness, aging, and death. Just like hunger and thirst. But you see, when we don't have this understanding, this wisdom, we get so attached to labels, don't we? And titles and hierarchy and all this stuff. And we begin to think that people, because of their position in society, their titles, you think that they're not human anymore. They're almost gods or close to gods. But that is just because we're caught in delusion. Because of all what you call the world of social convention. And yes, we need social convention, but it is, how do you say? It is artificial, and it is impermanent, right? It is impermanent. Because it doesn't matter what status you have in society, again, you're still subject to sickness, aging, and death. It's that simple. And of course, initially, I know for Westerners, when they first hear about that things are unsatisfactory, uncertain, they see this as something very negative, as something very judgmental. What do you mean unsatisfactory? There are many things that are are wonderful, or many things that are satisfactory. That says yes, we can feel satisfied or gratified for a short time, but it's impermanent. We can only feel satisfied or gratified only for a short time. It doesn't last forever. It's like, you could have the most wonderful meal and think, my goodness, I'll never have to eat again. Right? It's been so wonderful. The best meal you've ever had in your life. But as you know, a few hours later, the hunger comes back, right? Because we're a process. So here's the interesting thing. Why do we humans keep overlooking this fact that we're a process of body and mind? Why is it so easily to overlook this fact? Well, part of it is, of course, we don't have the mindfulness. We don't have the mindfulness practice and the reflection. But the main reason is because, again, we're caught in our social world of language, labels, I, you, he, she, and of course titles, names, Mr. Go, Miss Tan, and Bhante Kovida, So we because of this, we tend to see ourselves as personalities, ego personalities, ourselves. That's the reason. And that's why we easily overlook this fundamental fact that we are a process of body and mind, and that's where we're alive. Because once you begin to reflect on this, it is so obvious. So obvious. And why things change. One moment you're feeling happy, and the next moment you're not feeling so happy. It's like this. And that's the true meaning of unsatisfactoriness. It just means that anything that is satisfying us, or anything that feels good, it doesn't last. And because things don't last, it is uncertain. And initially, some people don't like to hear that word, things are uncertain, right? The fear of the unknown, or the fear of change, right? Because these are some of the fears we have. Because of our clinging mind and our lack of understanding, we want to be certain about certain things, right? Or, we don't want certain things to change. Again, because of personal clinging, attachment. But as you know, things change whether we like it or not. And that's why the Buddha said, when we really investigate, train our minds, reflect, then we have this understanding, this wisdom. And when we have this wisdom, there is no need to believe. There's no need to believe. And again, this is very challenging, because we're so conditioned that you must believe something, or you don't believe. But believing is very different from understanding. And beliefs, and again, I can understand why people cling to beliefs or to certain ideas, because it gives a sense of comfort, security, and in the case of reincarnation, rebirth, it gives you a sense that I will continue somehow after death. Although you're not sure, but somehow it gives you a sense of confidence. I believe this, I believe that, or I believe in God. And I'll go have eternal life after death. It gives you, of course, a sense of confidence. So I can understand that. But you see, any belief at all is never secure, because it's not based on wisdom, on understanding. And this is why if somebody says something and challenges your belief and say, your belief is rubbish, of course you get very upset. Because the fear is there. You get anxious. So beliefs are never secure. And a good example of this, we don't have to believe whether, this evening the sun is going to set, it's going to get dark, and tomorrow morning the sun is going to rise and it's going to be, daylight again. We don't have to believe that, do we? Because we know, right, from personal experience, this is going to happen whether we like it or not. But I understand it's very difficult for people to let go of their beliefs. And this is why now I'm at the stage where I just say to people, believe what you want to believe. Anything. Doesn't matter. But understand that what is more important is present moment awareness, the practice of mindfulness. Because it's only through mindfulness we're able to overcome dukkha, mental, emotional suffering, disturbance. That is the most important thing. So believe anything you want to believe. But mindfulness is the most important thing. Now, as we said, to understand the teaching of non-self, we have to understand what self is, because we do have a self. You can't avoid it. It's a part of our conditioning. And when you investigate, you begin to see the self is created by language, social language, names, and of course thinking process. So to really understand the thinking process, we have to understand what thinking is. And I mentioned this last week. Because unfortunately we're not taught to understand the thinking process in high school. At least high school level, they should be teaching this. Because we're only taught subjects, right? But they should be teaching us to understand thinking. Because we're thinking all the time. But all we are taught that we must study hard, our subject, and we have to pass exams. So we can, go on to college, get qualified, you go into the working world, and so on. Hopefully get married, having a family. But we're never taught to understand ourselves, and part of it, of course, is thinking. Because the I is a creation of thinking. And as you know, we need thinking in daily life, but most of our suffering comes from thinking. The dukkha really comes from thinking. When thinking becomes very irrational, very obsessive, very negative, very judgmental. All that is created by thinking. And this is why they should teach this. And it's not difficult, as I mentioned last week. It's not rocket science, rocket science, something very complex. It's very simple. And when you investigate, you begin to see that thinking is a response to three things in the mind. Memory, past experience, knowledge, information. And when you look, you can see it. It's so obvious, isn't it? Thinking, memory, all right? Memory is obviously connected to thinking. And of course, past experience is related to memory. And of course, knowledge, information, all the knowledge, information we have is related to thinking. It's so obvious. This is when I first came upon this teaching in India. It was just such a revelation. I was so happy just to have that simple revelation. Because that was one of the questions I had. What is thinking? But nobody seems to know. And even if you take a course, when you go to college and you take a course in, Psychology 101, sometimes the way they teach it, sometimes it's not even clear. They kind of go around it, like, go around the bush, as they say. But it's not precise. Psychology 101, yeah. And of course, or thinking, because it's related to all this past information that's stored in the brain, it has that ability to project in the future. And you can see that in your own minds. So we're either thinking about things related to the past, or we're projecting in the future. All our minds do this. So thinking is a movement in time. Past the future, right? You can see that. All our minds do this. And it doesn't matter what language we're thinking in. That is what is so interesting. Cantonese, Hokkien, Teochew, Bahasa Malay, English, French, Russian, Japanese, it's the same thought process. Same thought process, moving in time. Because that's the nature of the thought process, which is conditioning, based on conditioning. Knowledge, experience, education, and so on. And of course, the I, the self, is part of that movement in time. Memory, future plans, and so on. As I mentioned last week, you can see this more clearly when you meet somebody for the first time. And you naturally, talk about yourselves. And when you talk about yourselves, what do we talk about? All memories based on, personal history, isn't it? Family history, where you grew up, education history, elementary, high school, etc., etc. And if you're in the working world, of course, you have your work history. Books you have read, movies you have seen, of course now TV, all the TV programs, things you've seen on the internet. And if you've traveled, you speak about your traveling experiences. Speak about all your past experiences, some pleasant, some unpleasant. And so on, so, did this horrible thing to me. And you cling to that unpleasant experience. And if we're not speaking ourselves, relating to memory, we think about future projection, right? Plans, hopes and dreams, things you like to do, things you like to achieve, and so on. You can see that. Because it's all related to thinking, this movement in time. So that is the condition. And then, of course, this is something the Buddha saw very clearly when he became awakened. Because he saw that awareness, present moment, mindfulness was something different. Something different from the conditioning, the thought process moving in time. There's always now. Awareness is always now. That's right. It's not related to past and future. It is unconditioned. And it is our wisdom mind, the ability to see things as they are. And seeing things coming and going. See the impermanent nature of the mind. Thinking and all our mental formations, including even the beliefs we cling to. Likes and dislikes, it's all coming and going. So the Buddha, when he became awakened, he no longer identified with the thought process. Because most of us are trapped in thinking. We identify totally with the thought process. And when the mind says I, we think this I is who we are, right? But when you become awakened, you realize the I is just a social label. It's just a thought, really. It's just a thought, just a label. But who we really are is the awareness, the knowing, the intuitive knowing that can see things coming and going, that whatever arises passes away. Speaking of time, how are we doing for time? I forgot to bring my clock.
Yes.
Oh yes. So at this time, I would like to welcome some questions.
Okay, one question. How do you explain hallucinations in the human mind, especially when you're aged? Normally aged people have, I mean they call it dementia or whatever. They hallucinate all kinds of scenarios in the mind.
Yes.
How do you explain that?
Same as young children having a lot of fantasy, including imagining ghosts and spirits. But it's the same thing. It's just a delusion of the mind. It's just delusion. But of course, dementia is a more, it's a more severe condition because it has to do with the brain cells deteriorating. So there's a loss of memory, you have hallucinations, and there's one form of dementia where people get very abusive, just cursing and swearing, like this. Yeah. Which is very challenging, especially when you have to live with somebody like that. Always screaming, shouting, cursing. It's very challenging, but it's just one aspect of dementia. And as you know, there are different forms of dementia. And what's that, that memory loss, Alzheimer's, is just one kind, and there are other forms too. Yeah. Do you know about the coconut oil therapy for dementia? It's on the internet. Apparently, good quality coconut oil, not the normal cooking coconut oil. Apparently, if you take it, if you give somebody who's having the early sign of dementia, it actually helps. There's an enzyme in good quality coconut oil that apparently stops the deterioration of the brain cells. And the lady who first published this on internet, it was a Scottish doctor, a researcher, and she and her colleagues were researching dementia and coconut oil therapy. And during the research, her husband started to show early forms of dementia. So she had the perfect guinea pig living at home. So every morning when she cooked him breakfast, they like to eat oats porridge, oatmeal. She would put like 2 tablespoons of coconut oil, and it actually stopped the deterioration. And then she published it on the internet. Yeah. So it's a good thing to remember. If you yourself start to experience it, or somebody that is experiencing it, that is one possibility. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for explaining the profound knowledge using simple language. It's the first time I heard about the concept of anatta being explained as conditioned self, which is still struggling with that.
Of course.
The conditioned self, as you explained, is part of memory, knowledge, and experience. So, as we pass away, I think this conditioned self, or the I, is it part of memory that we transfer to a new body, or?
You're assuming, of course, that there's a rebirth or reincarnation, right?
Yes.
You see, you're projecting in the future, because that's the nature of thinking.
Buddha said there's a reincarnation, a rebirth.
Are you really sure about that? Because I always say to people, he never had a Sony recording machine, and there was no video camera, recording the Buddha. Always remember that. And this is why I only speak from my own experience and investigation. Investigation is very important.
There's a part that I still cannot
Right.
understand or cannot believe.
I know, of course, but it takes reflection. You know, Ramana Maharshi, one of the last great enlightened beings from India. You might have heard of him, Ramana Maharshi. Maybe another time I'll tell you about him. Because his awakening was so unique when he was only 17 years old. Can you imagine? 16? And it happened very spontaneously. Whenever he was asked this age-old question, you know, what happens to me when I die, or, you know, where do I go from death? He gave a wonderful answer. He said, tell me, when you go to bed at night and you fall asleep, where do you go? Reflect on that. Because when we fall asleep, of course, there's no thinking and no I. Because that's the nature of consciousness. Consciousness is always changing. And of course, when we all go to bed tonight, unless you're too scared, where you want to stay up all night, we actually die every night, mentally, psychologically, for about 2 hours, where there's absolutely no consciousness. So even Malaysia does not exist, even KL. And if you don't like the government, you'll be happy to know in that deep sleep state, the government does not exist. Including people you don't like. Yeah. This is why there's an old saying. You know, when people are in deep sleep and they're not aware of anything, we say, that person is dead to the world. Do you remember that saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in a way, it's true. You know, physically you might be alive, but you know, mentally, psychologically, no consciousness. That's the nature of consciousness.
So Bhante, are you saying the Buddha may not say rebirth?
Yeah, he meant something different. But my understanding, and remember now, is my understanding. Because I've had the case where I explained my understanding. And you know what people did? They ran around the whole place. Ayo, Bhante Kovida from Canada, he don't believe in rebirth, he don't believe in rebirth. You know what I mean? Yeah. From my understanding, my own experience and investigation, I see it for sure. I see rebirth in the mind. Mental rebirth. They're rising and passing away, you know, of thoughts, ideas, images, mental formation. You can see things arising and passing away of feelings, sensations, because we're a process. That is it. This rebirth I see for sure. You understand? Yeah. So in other words, the aim in practice is to stop rebirth in the mind. So there's less dukkha and more peace. Or because it's so challenging, so difficult, you can say at least lessen the mental rebirth. You know, the craving, the clinging, you know, the aversion, the hatred, the jealousy, the delusion. Does that make sense? Yeah.
I'm a science student.
Yes. Yeah. But you see, part of the difficulty, and I realize, is the word itself, rebirth. You know, it's the moment because we're using this word with birth in it, we tend to think of some physical phenomena, right? You know, that something goes into another body. It's like when we first hear the word birth and death, we naturally think of physical birth, physical death, don't we?
Yes.
You know, a baby being born and somebody dying. Naturally. But when we practice and we focus our minds in the present moment, you see that there's much more to birth and death than, you know, physical birth, physical death. Again, arising and passing away of phenomena. Things happening all the time. That's right. Things happen.
Yeah. One more follow-up questions. How do you reconcile the story of how the body experience and people can remember past life?
Yes, I know. I've heard all this before. Put it this way. From early childhood, I've always had a good memory. And don't say it's because of past karma. It was just my genetic makeup. And being the last of 6 children, my older brothers and sisters were always amazed how I could remember things so early, because they just thought I was too young. But I could remember. Now I say this not to be boastful, but to show the fact that if it's one thing I don't remember, is a previous birth. You understand? So when I hear all these stories, I'll have people having all these memories, say, oh yeah, interesting, but to me, it's not interesting. I focus more on the Four Noble Truths. The truth of dukkha and the ending of dukkha. And the Buddha always came back to this one point. Whatever you're discussing, debating, you always came at this one point. I only teach one thing. The truth of dukkha and the ending of dukkha. Okay? But sometimes I joke when people talk about reincarnation, rebirth. I said, in my previous life I used to believe that, but in this life I don't. And some people don't even get the joke. They give me this horrified look. What kind of Buddhist monk are you? Yes, any other questions? Yes.
I have this sort of feeling like somebody close to me who are about passed away, which I don't know, but actually it happens after that sort of feeling. Why it caused my mind? You understand?
What do you feel the person, or you imagine the person being
No.
there?
There are signs to tell me that somebody close to me is in the past.
Uh-huh.
That sort of feeling. Why is it the mind or is it how it happens? I don't know that particular person that died. But sure enough, afterwards.
Right. Well, as we said, everything comes from the mind. So anything we experience or imagine, it all comes from the mind. But as I said, life is a great mystery. So in some ways, anything is possible. Well, I know what you mean. Sometimes you have a premonition that someone has died.
Yeah, actually it happened.
Yeah. So I would say it's just a natural instinct. I just say it's just a natural instinct.
If I really don't know the person, but
Yeah.
the person died,
Mhm.
it just happened.
Yeah, I think it's just a natural instinct, and some people have that, and some people don't. It's like that. And that very amazing coincidence, but that happens all the time. You think of a person that you haven't thought of in a long time, and you get email from them, or or you get a phone call from them, out of the blue.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
This happens all the time. Yeah. But it's just coincidence, and of course, being human and we have the same makeup, of course, we are connected. We are connected. It's just like we can feel compassion even for strangers. And this is why
Quite far away, and then the person who stays quite far away
Yes.
is my close relative.
Mm.
I sort of knew such thing going to happen.
Yes.
I really find it very strange.
You have great psychic powers. But when people talk about psychic powers, I like to say that the greatest psychic power of all is to have compassion for all beings in the world. That is, to me, that is the greatest psychic power. To really empathize, with the suffering and joys of all beings in the world. But the other psychic power stuff, not too important.
Regarding Sotapanna, the 7 rebirth. Is this rebirth mental rebirth or is
You're asking the wrong person. I know. When I first came to Malaysia in 74, 75, and that was a past life. Yes. Because to me, that's what past life is. Yesterday is a past life, last week, Monday is a past life. When I was here in 94, 95, of course it's a past life. And when you know what's interesting? Just before I come to your question, when we think of past lives, we think of lives that are separate from this life. But when you really investigate and you practice, you begin to see that we have been through many lives from childhood. Many, many. And a good example of this, if you could find all your photos, you know, from early childhood, and you line them up until today, or recent photos, do you ever look the same? Of course not. Constantly changing. Again, the reality of process, body and mind. That's right. So, yes, to go back to your question again, can you just repeat it? Oh, Satapana, yeah. Yeah, why I brought up 1974 is because when I came here, and subsequent visits to Malaysia, you know, the Burmese method was very popular. You know, Mahasi Sayadaw, and if you study Burmese method and their teaching is a lot, they go into detail, right? Satapana, Anagami, Anaragami, blah, 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 Jhana 1, Jhana 2, Jhana 3, Jhana 4, up to even 10 Jhana. And people, of course, are caught in craving. They want to achieve this, 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 this. So much headache, so much delusion. And I always say, because I'm not a scholar, that all these levels of attainment that you read about what the Burmese teacher, yes, they are interesting, but they're only concepts. Don't cling to them. Same with jhana. I've met so many people, they were chasing jhanas, they got very confused. And after a while, they didn't know what jhana they were in. Am I in 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1.2, 2.7, 3.3? You know what I mean? It only encouraged craving, more dukkha. This is why I rarely use that word jhana, because it's been polluted. I rather use the word stillness. Stillness. In India, of course, they use samadhi, but it's the same thing. Yeah, just stillness. So I hope I've answered your question. Yes. Okay.